The 1897 inauguration, in addition to being the first captured on film with a motion picture camera, was also the first in which Congress hosted a luncheon for the incoming president and vice president following the president's inaugural address. Though the inauguration of Grover Cleveland in 1893 was a notable one, as it marked to date the only inauguration of a president to a second non-consecutive term, due to a snowstorm and cold winds, the crowd was small, and many scheduled inaugural events were canceled. Though his inaugural address was half the length of his grandfather's, Benjamin Harrison's speech is to date the fifth longest inaugural address, delivered in a downpour with the outgoing president holding the umbrella over Harrison's head. Amid the din of party strife, the people's choice was made, but its attendant circumstances have demonstrated anew the strength and safety of a government by the people. Grover Cleveland, 4th of March, 1885. The swearing-in of Chester A. Arthur took place at his private residence in New York City. To date, this was only the second time the presidential oath was administered in that city, the first being Washington's first inauguration in 1789. The inauguration of James A. Garfield marked the first time that the incoming president watched the inaugural parade from a stand built in front of the White House. As March 4th fell on a Sunday in 1877, Rutherford B. Hayes opted to take the oath of office on March 3rd in order to ensure the transition of power and became the first president to take the oath at the White House. The public ceremony took place on the 5th. The 1873 inauguration was the coldest on record for the March presidential inaugurations, with the temp only rising to 16 degrees Fahrenheit by noon. It was so cold that the inaugural ball, which was held in an unheated temporary structure, ended early when the food froze. The 1869 inauguration marked the last time to date that an outgoing president did not attend the inauguration of his successor. Ulysses Grant's inauguration was also notable as the first time tickets were required to gain entrance to the U.S. Capitol for the ceremony. I have long labored to ameliorate and elevate the condition of the great mass of the American people. Toil and an honest advocacy of the great principles of free government have been my lot. Duties have been mine, consequences are God's. Andrew Johnson, 15th April, 1865. The second inauguration of Abraham Lincoln marked the first time that African Americans participated in the inaugural parade. It was also the first inauguration in which Salmon P. Chase administered the oath of office as Chief Justice. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. Abraham Lincoln, 4th of March, 1861. The 1857 inauguration was the first inaugural ceremony to be photographed. Unfortunately, it occurred during the National Hotel epidemic, where an ailment made hundreds of guests at the hotel sick, and nearly 3 dozen, including incoming President James Buchanan's nephew, died. Franklin Pierce was the first president to recite his inaugural speech from memory. Unfortunately, his vice president did not hear it, as he had sought treatment in Cuba for an ultimately fatal ailment, and thus became the only VP to date to be sworn in while on foreign soil. Rather than being administered by the Chief Justice, the oath of office was administered to Millard Fillmore in the House chamber by Chief Justice of the D.C. Circuit Court William Cranch, the second time Cranch administered the oath in an extraordinary inauguration. Despite heavy snow in the evening, Zachary Taylor attended all 3 inaugural balls held in his honor on March 5, 1849. The price of attendance for each was $10, the equivalent of over $360 in modern currency. In addition to being the first inauguration to be covered by telegraph, the inauguration of James K. Polk in 1845 was also the earliest known instance of an inauguration being depicted in a newspaper illustration. As he was not in Washington, D.C. when President Harrison passed away, Tyler would not be sworn in as president at Brown's Hotel until 2 days later upon his return to the Capitol, the first extraordinary inauguration in U.S. history. In addition to being the first president-elect to arrive for the inauguration by train, the parade and inaugural ball for the inauguration of William Henry Harrison in 1841 were organized by the first ever inauguration committee. The inauguration of Martin Van Buren in 1837 marked the first time that the outgoing and incoming president rode together to the U.S. Capitol for the inauguration. Andrew Jackson's second inauguration in 1833 proved to be the last time that Chief Justice John Marshall would administer the oath of office to a president. It was also the first time more than one inaugural ball was held following the inaugural ceremony. Andrew Jackson became the first president to be inaugurated on the east portico of the U.S. Capitol at the ceremony in 1829, and a ship's cable was put in place to block the nearly 21,000 in attendance from advancing up the stairs to where Jackson was sworn in. John Quincy Adams later noted that, rather than following the tradition of placing his hand on a Bible, he instead placed his hand on a book of law while taking the oath of office at his inauguration in 1825. As it was the first inaugural to fall on a Sunday, James Monroe consulted with the Supreme Court, and they agreed to move the inauguration ceremonies to the next day. Due to a snowstorm, the inauguration was moved into the House chamber at the U.S. Capitol. The inauguration of James Monroe in 1817 was held on a platform outdoors in front of the brick Capitol, the temporary Capitol on the site of the current Supreme Court building. The repairs to the U.S. Capitol from the War of 1812 were not completed until 1819. The impressions on me are strengthened by such an evidence that my faithful endeavors to discharge my arduous duties have been favorably estimated, and by a consideration of the momentous period at which the trust has been renewed. James Madison, 4th of March, 1813. The first inaugural ball was held in 1809 in celebration of the inauguration of James Madison. This inauguration also marked the first of two instances to date when the vice president was inaugurated to a second term to serve under a different president than in the first. I shall now enter on the duties to which my fellow citizens have again called me, and shall proceed in the spirit of those principles which they have approved. I fear not that any motives of interest may lead me astray. Thomas Jefferson, 4th of March, 1805. In addition to being the first inauguration in Washington, D.C., the 1801 inauguration was the first peaceful transfer of power in U.S. history from a president of one party to a president of the opposing party. It was also the first time the Marine Band played at the event, to date an unbroken tradition since. In addition to being the first peaceful transfer of power in U.S. history from one president to another, the 1797 inauguration in Philadelphia was also the first time the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court administered the oath of office to the incoming president. At just 135 words, the inaugural speech of George Washington, delivered at the first of two inaugurations to date to be held in Philadelphia, is the current record holder for the shortest inaugural speech in U.S. history. On April 30th, 1789, George Washington took the oath of office as administered by Chancellor Robert Livingston on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City, New York, to become the first president of the United States.